When I finally learned the truth, I didn't cry or raise my voice. I didn't ask questions or demand answers. I just sat there at my kitchen table, holding my cup of tea with both hands, watching the steam rise slowly into the air. Everything around me looked the same. The clock kept ticking, the light outside the window stayed soft and warm, but inside me, something quietly broke apart. For 15 years, someone I trusted had known something about my life that I didn't. For 15 years, she watched me live with guilt and confusion, believing I was the reason my family fell apart. She watched me blame myself in silence, and she never spoke. That realization settled into my chest slowly, like a weight I didn't know how to lift. The kitchen was unusually quiet that afternoon. The children were grown now, living their own lives, far from this house that once felt too small for all the noise and laughter. The silence felt heavier than it used to. She sat across from me, hands folded, eyes tired. She looked older than I remembered, as if time had finally caught up with her. When she spoke, her voice was calm, and that calm frightened me more than anger ever could. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago," she said. Her words were soft, careful, like she was afraid of breaking something fragile. I looked at her face, trying to read it. I searched for regret, fear, or even hesitation, but all I saw was quiet resolve. In that moment, I knew my life was about to divide into two parts: everything I believed before and everything I was about to understand. I wasn't raised to expect happiness in big, loud ways. My mother believed in endurance more than joy. She used to say that peace came from accepting less, not asking for more. I grew up learning how to stay quiet, how to adjust myself to the needs of others, how to believe that love meant sacrifice. I carried those lessons into adulthood without realizing how deeply they shaped me. I married young, believing love would protect me from loneliness. He was kind at first, gentle in the way he spoke and patient in the way he listened. We didn't have much money, but we had plans. We had hope. Our house was small, with a narrow kitchen and a dining table that always felt crowded, but it felt like home. When our children were born, that home filled with purpose. I poured myself into that family completely, believing that if I gave enough, love would stay. His sister, Miriam, was always there. She was older than both of us, confident and composed. She spoke carefully and watched people closely. At family gatherings, others leaned toward her words. She remembered details, noticed small changes, and seemed to understand situations before anyone else did. She was never unkind to me, never rude or dismissive. Still, there was something distant about her, something reserved. Sometimes I felt like she could see through me, like she knew what I was feeling before I did. The changes in my marriage didn't arrive all at once. They came slowly, almost quietly. He started coming home later, conversations grew shorter, his attention drifted elsewhere. I asked him once, gently, if something was wrong. He smiled and said he was tired. I accepted that answer because I wanted to believe it. I told myself that marriage changes with time, that love becomes quieter, not weaker. But at night, when the house was still, I felt something was wrong. I lay awake listening to the clock, wondering where I had failed. I tried harder. I spoke less. I made myself smaller. And through all of it, Miriam stayed close. She checked on me, helped with the children, and sat beside me during quiet afternoons. She told me I was strong and that I was doing my best. Her words felt comforting. They made me feel seen. The day he left was not dramatic. There were no arguments, no shouting, just a suitcase by the door and a voice that sounded distant. He said he needed space. That was all. No explanation, no promise. I stood there, holding the edge of the table, trying to understand how a life could end so quietly. When the door closed behind him, The house felt empty in a way I had never known before. The days that followed were heavy and slow. The children asked questions I couldn't answer. I told them their father needed time. At night, I cried quietly so they wouldn't hear me. Miriam came often. She brought food, helped around the house, and sat with me when my thoughts became too loud. She told me again and again that it wasn't my fault, that I had done nothing wrong. I believed her because I needed to believe someone. Life didn't pause for my heartbreak. Bills still came, the children still needed care. I learned how to move forward without understanding how I was supposed to heal. I smiled when required, I stayed silent when it felt safer. But inside, guilt grew stronger. I told myself I wasn't enough, that I had failed as a wife, that love had left because I hadn't held it properly. Years passed quietly. The children grew up and moved away. The house became quiet again, just like it was that afternoon at the kitchen table. Sometimes I wondered what my life might have been if things had turned out differently, but I never looked too deeply into the past. Some memories felt too painful to touch. Until that day, sitting across from Miriam, hearing her say she had something to tell me, I felt something shift inside me. I didn't know what the truth was yet, but I knew it had waited a long time to be spoken, and I knew that once I heard it, I would never see my life the same way again. After she said there was something she needed to tell me, neither of us spoke right away. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, like the walls had moved closer without me noticing. I could hear the clock again, steady and patient, as if it had all the time in the world. I waited for her to continue, but she didn't. Instead, she looked down at her hands, rubbing her fingers together slowly, like she was trying to warm them. I didn't rush her. 15 years of silence doesn't break in a moment. I had learned that much about pain. Some things need time, even when they hurt. So I waited, my heart beating quietly, my thoughts tangled in questions I was afraid to ask. "You remember how things were back then?" she finally said. Her voice was low, almost careful. How confused everything felt. I nodded. Of course I remembered. Confusion had become a part of me. It followed me through every year that came after. I remembered lying awake at night, replaying conversations in my head, wondering where I went wrong. I remembered watching other couples grow old together and asking myself what I had done differently. I blamed myself for a long time, I said softly. Maybe I still do. She didn't look at me when I said that. Her silence told me more than words ever could. That was when I started to feel it, a small shift inside me, a thought I had never allowed myself to think before. What if I wasn't the only one who had carried this story? What if someone else had been holding parts of it too? But I pushed the thought away. It felt dangerous. In the days after that conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about her words, about the way she avoided my eyes, about the heaviness in her voice. I went through my routines as usual, but everything felt slower. Even the smallest tasks felt like they carried weight. I found myself remembering moments from the past that I had ignored before, small things, things that didn't seem important at the time. Like how Miriam always seemed to know when my husband wasn't coming home, how she would call or show up with food on those nights, how she never asked questions about where he was, only how I was feeling. At the time, I thought it was kindness. Now it felt like something else. I remembered how she had been the first to know he was leaving, how she showed up that same evening, already prepared, already calm. I told myself she was just being supportive, that she was family. But doubt has a way of growing once it's planted. I started to replay old conversations in my mind, ones I hadn't thought about in years. I remembered a time, early in my marriage, when Miriam had asked me if I was happy. The question had surprised me then, not because I wasn't happy, but because it felt too deep for a casual afternoon talk. "You deserve honesty," she had said, "even when it's uncomfortable." I had laughed it off, telling her everything was fine. She didn't argue, she just nodded, like she knew something I didn't. Back then, I thought she was being wise. Now, I wondered what she meant. The truth was, my marriage had never been perfect, but whose is? We had disagreements, quiet ones, the kind you don't talk about with others. But I never imagined betrayal. I never imagined secrets. I trusted him, and I trusted her. That trust was what made everything harder now. In the weeks that followed, Miriam avoided the subject. She visited less. When she did come by, she stayed only a short time. Our conversations stayed on safe ground. The weather, the children, small, harmless things. But the tension was always there, sitting between us like an unspoken question. One afternoon, I finally asked her, "Why now?" My voice was gentle, not accusing, just tired. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. She said, "Because I'm tired, and because you deserve to know." Those words stayed with me. You deserve to know. I wondered why she hadn't believed that before. As days passed, my sleep grew restless. Memories surfaced without warning. I would be folding laundry and suddenly remember a look on his face I hadn't understood at the time, or a conversation that ended too quickly, or the way he avoided eye contact during his last weeks at home. I realized how much of my life I had spent filling in gaps with blame, my own blame. I told myself I was too demanding, too quiet, too boring, too emotional. I created reasons that made his leaving make sense. It was easier to believe I had failed than to believe something darker had happened. Now, that belief felt fragile. I spoke to my children during one of their visits, carefully, without details. I asked them what they remembered about those days. They were older now, with lives of their own, but memories lingered. "You always tried," my daughter said. "I remember that." My son nodded. Dad was distant, even before he left. Their words were simple, but they cracked something open in me. Maybe the story I had told myself wasn't the whole truth. Miriam finally asked me to come over one evening. Her house was quiet, neat in the way only lonely houses are. She made tea, the same way she always had, careful and precise. We sat in her living room, the light dim, the air heavy. She said, "I should have spoken sooner. I know that." I didn't answer. I didn't know how. She took a deep breath. "There were things happening back then that you didn't see, things I saw." My heart began to beat faster, but I stayed quiet. She said, "He wasn't honest," slowly. "Not with you." That sentence felt like a door opening, a small one, just enough to let the cold air in. I waited. She told me about late nights, about phone calls she overheard, about conversations that stopped when she entered the room. She told me how she had asked him once if he was going to tell me the truth. She said, "He said he didn't want to hurt you. He said it would destroy you." I laughed softly when she said that, not because it was funny, but because it sounded familiar. That was the excuse everyone used, silence in the name of protection. "So you agreed?" I asked quietly. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with something like regret. She said, "I thought I was helping." That was when the anger tried to rise, but it didn't last. What I felt instead was sadness, a deep, quiet sadness. Helping, I realized, can sometimes be the most painful kind of harm. She told me how she had watched me struggle, how she had listened to me blame myself, how she had almost spoken many times. But there was never the right moment, she said, and the longer I waited, the harder it became. I understood that too. Secrets grow heavier with time. But understanding didn't erase the hurt. I thought about all the nights I cried alone, all the years I spent thinking I was unlovable, all the times I questioned my worth, and she had known. She didn't tell me everything that night. Not yet. She said she needed time, that some parts were still difficult to say. I went home feeling hollow, like I had opened an old wound without knowing how to close it. Over the next few weeks, I lived in between knowing and not knowing, between anger and compassion, between truth and silence. I noticed how differently I saw the past now, how moments shifted under this new light. I wondered who I might have been if I had known sooner, if I would have forgiven myself earlier, if I would have loved myself better. Miriam called me a morning, her voice shaky. She said, "I'm ready to tell you the rest." I didn't answer right away. I needed a moment to steady myself. "Come over," she said, "please." I sat alone for a while after the call ended. I looked around my house, at the furniture that had witnessed my quiet grief, at the walls that had held my secrets. I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by what I didn't know. And I realized something then. Whatever she was about to tell me, I was ready. Not because it wouldn't hurt, but because I was tired of carrying pain that wasn't mine. As I walked to her house that afternoon, the sky was overcast, the kind of day where everything feels muted. Fitting, I thought. She opened the door slowly. Her eyes were red, like she had been crying. She said, "I should have told you." I nodded. "Yes, I know." We sat down, facing each other, the distance between us smaller than it had ever been. She said, "This is the part I was most afraid of." And that was when I knew. The truth I was about to hear was not just about my marriage. It was about loyalty, about fear, and about how silence can change the shape of a life. When she said this was the part she had been most afraid of, I felt my chest tighten. Not because I expected something shocking, but because I knew whatever came next would finally put a shape to the pain I had lived with for so long. Some pains are worse when they have no name. Once they are named, they still hurt, but at least you know what you are carrying. We sat facing each other in her living room. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a soft, gray light that made everything look faded. The room smelled faintly of tea and old furniture. It felt like a place where secrets could live quietly for years. She took a deep breath and pressed her hands together. "I need you to listen to everything," she said, "and I need you not to stop me until I finish." I nodded. My mouth felt dry, but I trusted myself not to break. "It started earlier than you think," she said. Those words alone shifted something inside me. She told me it began before my marriage felt broken, before the late nights, before the suitcase by the door. She said there were signs I never noticed, and signs I noticed but explained away because I wanted peace more than truth. She said he had met someone else. The words landed softly, almost gently, but they carried weight. I didn't gasp or cry. I felt a strange stillness instead, like the moment just before a storm. I had imagined this possibility many times over the years. I had told myself it was dramatic thinking, the kind that only made pain worse. Hearing it spoken out loud felt both familiar and unreal. "He told me first," she said, "not you." That hurt more than I expected. She explained how he had come to her, confused and restless, saying he didn't know what he wanted anymore, that he felt torn between responsibility and desire, that he didn't want to be the kind of man who destroyed his family. "He said he still loved you," she added quickly, like she needed to soften the blow. "But he said he felt trapped." I closed my eyes for a moment. I remembered all the times I tried to be smaller so he wouldn't feel burdened, all the ways I tried to make our life easier for him. The word trapped echoed in my mind, sharp and unfair. She went on, explaining how she had begged him to be honest with me, how she told him I deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. But he refused. "He said you wouldn't survive it," she said quietly. "He said it would break you." I laughed under my breath when she said that, not because it was funny, but because it sounded like something people say to excuse their own fear. They talk about protecting you when really they are protecting themselves. She said she believed him at first, that she saw how fragile I looked in those days, how tired, how devoted to my family. She thought silence might spare me. "So you agreed to hide it?" I said. She nodded slowly. "At first, yes." She told me how she watched him pull away from me, how she knew where he went on nights he said he was working late. She told me how she covered for him, how she answered questions from other family members, how she helped him leave quietly when the time came. "I thought it would be easier if it ended cleanly, if you thought it was just distance, not betrayal." That word sat between us for a long moment. Betrayal. I had lived with it without knowing its name. She explained how he had promised me to tell me eventually, how he said he needed time, how time turned into months, then years, how he built a new life somewhere else while I stayed behind, piecing together a broken one. "And you let me believe it was my fault," I said. She looked down. "Yes." That was the moment something inside me finally broke open, not in anger, but in release. The blame I had carried for 15 years loosened its grip, just enough for me to breathe. I asked her why she never spoke up later, why she didn't tell me after he left, after I struggled, after I cried in her arms. She said the truth had become too heavy by then, that she was afraid of losing me, afraid of destroying what little stability I had rebuilt. "I thought you were healing," she said. "I didn't want to open the wound again." I wanted to tell her that the wound had never closed, that it had simply learned how to hide, but I stayed quiet. She told me there was more. She said the other woman wasn't a stranger, that she had been someone around the family for a time, someone I had met, someone who had smiled at me across tables and spoken kindly. I felt my stomach tighten. "She knew about you," Miriam said, "about the children, about everything." I thought about all the moments that suddenly made sense, the strange looks, the awkward silences, the feeling that I was being measured without knowing why. I asked if he had loved her. Miriam paused before answering. She said he thought he did, but I think he was running from something in himself. That answer didn't bring comfort, but it brought clarity. This was never about me being enough or not. It was about choices made quietly and carried loudly by others. She told me how the relationship ended eventually, how it didn't last, how he moved on again, restless as ever, how his life never settled the way he hoped it would. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that, just sadness, for him, for me, for all of us. I asked her why she was telling me now after all this time. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Because I'm tired of carrying this, and because you deserve the truth before more time passes." I nodded slowly. I understood that part. Some truths demand to be spoken no matter how late they arrive. I went home that evening feeling lighter and heavier all at once. Lighter because the weight of blame was finally lifting, heavier because the truth had shape now and it hurt to hold. I sat alone in my living room, letting the memories come. I replayed moments with new understanding. The nights he came home distant, the mornings he avoided my eyes, the way he said goodbye to the children with too much care, like he was already gone. I cried that night, but it was different from before. These tears were not about failure, they were about loss. In the days that followed, I moved through the world differently. I noticed how my shoulders felt less tense, how my thoughts were clearer, how my self-blame softened. I realized how deeply silence had shaped me, how believing I was unlovable influenced my choices, my confidence, my sense of worth. I thought about all the years I spent trying to earn love that was never mine to earn, and I felt a quiet grief for the woman I was back then, doing her best with half the truth. Miriam called a few days later, asking how I was. Her voice sounded uncertain, like she was afraid of my answer. "I'm okay," I said, and for the first time, I meant it in a way I hadn't before.
We spoke carefully after that, slowly, like people learning how to talk again after a long silence. I didn't forgive her right away. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't a single moment, it's a process. But I didn't hate her either. I understood her fear, her mistakes, her weakness. Understanding didn't erase the pain, but it softened its edges. I also reached out to my children, telling them parts of the truth they were old enough to hear. I didn't give details. I didn't speak badly of their father. I just told them that what happened was not because I failed. They listened quietly. "I always knew," my daughter said softly. "I just didn't know how to say it." Her words stayed with me. Children see more than we think. That night, I stood by my window looking out at the dark sky and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not complete, not perfect, but real. The truth hadn't destroyed me. It had freed me. I knew there was still work ahead, feelings to untangle, forgiveness to consider, relationships to redefine. But for the first time in 15 years, I felt like my life made sense. And that changed everything.
After the truth came out, life didn't suddenly become easier. It didn't turn bright overnight. Healing never works that way. But something inside me had shifted, and that shift changed how I moved through my days. I was no longer carrying a story that blamed me for everything. I was carrying the truth. And even though it hurt, it felt lighter. The first few mornings after that conversation were strange. I woke up feeling unsure of who I was supposed to be now. For so long, my identity had been shaped by loss and self-doubt. I was the woman who wasn't enough, the woman who had failed to keep her family together. Now, that version of me didn't fit anymore, but I didn't yet know who replaced her. I moved slowly through my routines. I made tea, I watered the plants, I folded laundry. Ordinary things felt different, like I was doing them with new hands. I noticed how often my mind went back to the past, replaying moments with fresh understanding. Each memory felt like a thread being gently untangled. I allowed myself to feel everything. The sadness came first. Sadness for the marriage I thought I had. Sadness for the years I spent believing lies about myself. Sadness for the younger version of me who tried so hard to be perfect. I let myself cry when the tears came, without shame. These tears were not weakness, they were release. Then came the anger, soft and quiet, not loud or consuming. It surprised me how gentle it felt. I wasn't angry in the way movies show anger. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to shout. I just felt a deep disappointment, not only in him, but in the silence that surrounded me for so long, in the way truth had been delayed in the name of protection. I thought often about Miriam, about the role she played, about the nights she held my hand while knowing what she knew. Forgiveness did not come easily. Some days I felt understanding. Other days I felt distance. I realized forgiveness wasn't something I could decide on a single afternoon. It was something I would have to walk towards slowly. We met again a week later. She looked nervous when she arrived, like she was unsure whether she was welcome. I invited her in anyway. The door closing behind her felt symbolic, like the end of something old and the beginning of something uncertain. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quietly. "I just needed you to know." I appreciated that honesty. It gave me space to breathe. "I'm still figuring out how I feel," I told her, "but I'm glad I know the truth." She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I understand." We talked carefully that day, about the past, about fear, about the way good intentions can still cause harm. She told me how carrying the secret had changed her too, how it weighed on her conscience, how she avoided mirrors some days because she didn't like who she saw. Listening to her didn't erase my pain, but it reminded me that silence had damaged more than one life. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice small changes in myself. I stood a little straighter, I spoke a little more confidently, I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. These changes were quiet, but they mattered. I reached out to old friends I had distanced myself from over the years, people I pulled away from because I felt ashamed of my story. I found comfort in simple conversations, in laughter that didn't feel forced. I realized how much connection I had denied myself because I believed I didn't deserve it. I also started writing again, just for myself. Thoughts, memories, feelings I had never allowed to surface. Writing helped me see how strong I had been, even when I felt broken. It reminded me that surviving 15 years of quiet pain was not weakness, it was resilience. One afternoon, I found an old photograph tucked away in a drawer. It showed me standing in my kitchen years ago, smiling, unaware of what was coming. I studied that woman's face for a long time. She looked hopeful, trusting. I felt tenderness toward her. Instead of judging her for what she didn't know, I thanked her for enduring what she did. Forgiveness, I learned, starts with yourself. My relationship with my children grew deeper during this time. They noticed the change in me. I was calmer, more present, less burdened. We spoke more openly, though still gently. I didn't need to explain everything. They understood enough. One evening, my son said something that stayed with me. "You seem lighter," he said, "like you're finally breathing." I smiled when he said that, because he was right. As for Miriam, our relationship remained complicated. There were days I welcomed her presence and days I needed space. She respected that. She didn't push, she didn't ask for reassurance. That patience mattered. One day she said something unexpected. "I wish I could go back and choose differently," she said, even if it meant losing people. I believed her. Time passed, months went by. The sharp edges of the truth softened. The memories still came, but they didn't cut as deeply. I learned how to live with what I knew without letting it define me completely. I thought about my former husband sometimes, but without the old ache. I saw him now as a flawed man who made choices he didn't want to own. I stopped wondering what I could have done differently. That question no longer served me. Forgiveness towards him came quietly, without ceremony, not because he asked for it, but because I didn't want to carry bitterness any longer. Forgiveness didn't mean excusing what he did. It meant releasing myself from its hold. One morning, as sunlight filled my kitchen, I realized something important. My life had not ended when he left. It had paused, reshaped, and continued in ways I hadn't expected. I was still here, still capable of love, still worthy of peace. I began to imagine the future again, not in grand plans, but in small hopes. More mornings like this one, more honest conversations, more moments of quiet joy. The truth arrived late, but it arrived. And when it did, it didn't destroy me. It gave me my life back, piece by piece. I wasn't the woman who had been left behind anymore. I was the woman who survived silence, faced truth, and chose to heal. And that felt like enough. As time moved forward, I learned something important. Healing does not arrive like a knock on the door. It arrives quietly. Sometimes it sits beside you without saying a word. Sometimes it waits until you are ready to notice it. I didn't wake up one morning feeling completely whole, but I did wake up feeling less afraid of my own thoughts. I began to enjoy silence again. For many years, silence felt heavy. It felt like proof that something was wrong with me. Now, silence felt different. It felt honest. It gave me space to listen to myself without judgment. I could sit by the window, watch the light change, and not feel the need to explain my life to anyone. I thought often about the years I lost to believing a story that wasn't true. 15 years is a long time. It holds birthdays, quiet evenings, moments that never happened because I didn't believe I deserved them. But I stopped thinking of those years as wasted. They shaped me. They taught me patience, strength, and empathy. They taught me how to survive even when I didn't understand why I had to. There were days when grief still visited me. It came softly, like an old friend. I learned not to push it away.
Grief, I realized, was just love with nowhere to go. I let it pass through me, trusting that it wouldn't stay forever. I also learned how important truth is, even when it arrives late. Truth doesn't erase pain, but it gives pain a place to rest. Without truth, the heart keeps searching for answers, blaming itself, questioning its worth. With truth, the heart can finally stop running. Sometimes I wondered how different my life might have been if I had known earlier, but I didn't let that question take root. It led nowhere useful. What mattered was what I chose to do with the truth now, and I chose peace. My relationships grew quieter but deeper. I stopped trying to please everyone. I stopped explaining myself when I didn't need to. I learned that love doesn't require constant sacrifice of self. Real love makes room for who you are. I found joy in small routines, morning tea, folding warm clothes, calling a friend just to ask how their day was. These moments grounded me. They reminded me that life doesn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful. I also forgave myself for staying silent for so long, for accepting blame that was never mine, for shrinking myself to keep others comfortable. That forgiveness mattered the most. One evening, as I sat alone with a lamp glowing softly beside me, I thought about the woman I had become. She wasn't loud, she wasn't perfect, but she was honest. She had learned how to sit with her pain without letting it define her. She had learned how to choose kindness without abandoning herself. I realized something else that night. Forgiveness is not a gift you give someone else. It's a gift you give yourself. It frees your hands so you can hold the life still waiting for you. I didn't forget what happened. I didn't erase it, but it no longer controlled me. It became part of my story, not the whole story. Hope returned slowly. It didn't arrive as excitement or big dreams. It arrived as calm, as trust, as the belief that tomorrow could be gentle. That belief was enough. If there is one lesson my life taught me, it is this. Silence can protect for a while, but truth heals for a lifetime, and sometimes even delayed truth can still save you. I learned that people can love you and still hurt you, that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes, and that understanding this doesn't make you bitter, it makes you wise. I also learned that it is never too late to reclaim yourself. No matter how many years pass, no matter how long you lived under a shadow, you are still allowed to step into the light. Today, when I look in the mirror, I no longer search for faults. I see a woman who endured, who learned, who chose healing over resentment. I see someone who survived 15 years of not knowing and still found the courage to move forward. I don't tell my story for sympathy. I tell it because someone out there may be carrying a burden that doesn't belong to them. Someone may be blaming themselves for a silence they didn't create. If my story reaches them, I want them to know this. You are not broken because you didn't know. You are not weak because you trusted, and you are not too late to begin again. Life does not end when truth arrives late. Sometimes that's exactly when it begins. And now, when the house is quiet and the day is done, I sit with gratitude for the lessons, for the strength I didn't know I had, for the peace that came after the storm. I breathe in, I breathe out, and for the first time in a long time, I feel at home within myself.